Well, the U.S. State Department says many African countries are doing a better job combating modern slavery. More than a dozen African nations received upgrades in the report. Joining us here in studio is Maurice Middleburg. He is the executive director of the non-profit organization Free the Slaves. Maurice, welcome to Africa 54.
Thank you, Vincent. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you with us. Now, as we've seen, we just mentioned that Africa has kind of gotten some credit for fighting this. In fact, for many people, they can't even fathom the idea that it's modern slavery. Where are the improvements, and in which countries would you say things are still bad?
Well, as you say, there's a dozen countries who have really done very well, clearly have upgrades. I would point to the example of Ghana, which has done particularly well. And in part, that's attributable to the Child Protection Compact that Ghana has signed with the United States of America and the financial and technical support and the cooperation between the two countries. So it's a very good example of how progress is possible. Now, there were downgrades for Gabon and for South Africa, and the contrast between them is quite striking because what it tells us is that this is a choice, that the developed world and the African countries have a choice to make about whether they want to rigorously pursue the eradication of slavery or frankly be complicit or negligent in it. And that's what this report really demonstrates.
Now, let's face it, there are people in Africa who may look at the title and perhaps the organization and say, Free the Slaves. Like, who is selling slaves? I mean, my country does not trade in slaves. Can we break it down? What amount or what constitutes slavery or trafficking of humans?
Okay, so first to say that every country in the world is afflicted with slavery. So this is not particularly about Africa. It is a phenomenon that's present everywhere, including the United States. And what we mean by slavery is that people, through force or fraud or coercion, are being held at a workplace or in a place of sexual exploitation for economic exploitation. This is an economic crime where somebody is stealing their labor. So they're using violence, they're using threat, they're using menace in order to have people work, be it in a factory, a farm, a mine, or a brothel, in order to steal all the profit from their work.
Now, there are cases, though, where even families may offer their own daughter or son to another family. How do you have this understand that this is a form of slavery and it's not acceptable, even if there is a consent from the side of the
right.
parents?
Well, so multiple variants of the problem you just described. There's the problem of forced marriage, where girls, often quite young girls, are basically given to pay off a debt or to otherwise satisfy an obligation that they have to some other party. And that really then has to do with the poverty and vulnerability of the family that does that. It also has to do with gender discrimination and the rights of children. Because when there are norms that do not value women and girls, when there are norms that treat children as property rather than as beings with intrinsic rights, all of those are what make women, girls, and children particularly susceptible to being trafficked.
Yes. Now, in the case of, for example, the practice of a very commonly used word in many African countries is a house help or a maid.
Right.
Can people also see that as a form of slavery, even when it looks like they're actually employing these young kids?
Well, look, here's the thing to understand about modern slavery. It often looks normal. It's not in the days where people were literally in shackles and it was manifest that they were in slavery. Often they just look like they had a job on a farm, on a mine, in a household. But it's the condition of that employment where the household help that you just described, what we would call domestic servitude, the person is being really held there against their will through threat, through violence, through coercion of their family, and not receiving any payment. They're basically enslaved within the household, and this is really quite common.
Now, how do you resolve this problem in countries such as the DRC, where part of the contributing factor to the problem festering is actually conflict?
Right. So we actually have a program. We Free the Slaves have a program in Eastern Congo and North and South Kivu, where we've actually made quite significant progress in the communities in which we work. These are the communities where mining takes place, particularly artisanal, informal mining, and people get into debt or they're otherwise coerced by militias. But what we have learned how to do is to build collective community resistance to slavery. by educating people, mobilizing people, working with local authorities, working with local religious leaders, and actually communicating with militia leaders. We, in fact, have been able to make significant progress in those communities in which we have programs. So again, the message here is progress is possible. It's a question of making the necessary investments and making the right choices.
In the countries you work in, say the DRC and other African countries, do they have like legislation at the national level or even local governments where at least it's clear that it's illegal to do this?
Yes, slavery is illegal now in every country in the world. There is no longer any country which provides a legal sanction. The problem is more about the implementation and enforcement of what's in the law. Because the reality is those laws are often on the books, they're there in theory and in principle, but they're not actually being implemented. And again, it comes back to this issue of will the necessary investments and choices be made by the governments? And what we find is that there's great laxity in this, and you see it in the very minimal number of arrests and prosecutions that are made for modern-day slavery. And there you have the problem.
Well, we hope this goes away someday. Thank you for joining us.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Thank you so much. That's very kind.
Appreciate it.
Certainly.
Well, Maurice Middleburg is Executive Director of Free the Slaves. Thank you very much.